Dust settled over Tombstone like a mourning shroud. In the dusty square, a rickety wooden grandstand stood, trembling in the wind. People crowded together, cowboy hats covering their eyes, leaving only the flickering oil light to cast a distorted darkness. Above, a figure appeared, a young woman, beautiful enough to silence the grandstand. But it was not the radiant beauty of life. It was a hard beauty, marked by pain and despair. Her eyes were sunken, glistening as if they were holding back rain that had never fallen. In her trembling arms, a tiny creature huddled in an old burlap sack, so small it seemed to vanish in the western wind. The mother clutched the child, her every breath a battle, holding on to her child and her last shred of dignity in the crowd. Below, the men stood crowded together, some squinting, some swallowing, all watching like crows waiting for a carcass. But in that moment, the whole town fell silent, for no one dared deny that the scene on stage was the most naked of the West, a place where a human being could be turned into a commodity, a young life placed in the cruel wheel of fate. A deep, drawn-out voice, like a knife cutting through the night, rang out. "Who is the first bidder?" The auctioneer raised his arm, his pale hand held out like a death sentence. The crowd responded with boos. Silver coins were pulled from the pockets of his leather jacket. Numbers. Prices were shouted out, like the howls of wolves around prey. Her shoulders shook, her small hands clasped tightly around the child. Her breathing was rapid, as if she feared that if she let go of her arms for even a moment, the child would fall from her grasp and disappear forever. Her face was bowed, but her desperate eyes still furtively glanced down at the crowd below. And in those looks, she recognized everything. The eagerness of those who craved possession, the cold indifference of those who considered this just a pastime, and the silent sorrow of a few weak eyes that did not have the strength to stand up. The oil lamps cast yellow streaks of light on the stage, but could not hide the truth. This was no longer a market, but a trial, where human dignity was for sale, where people's hearts were revealed in every scream, every coin thrown to the dusty ground. Time seemed to stop. On the stage, she stood there motionless, her tear-filled eyes reflecting the faint light of the oil lamp. Her beauty was not that of a radiant life, but that of a withered flower still trying to maintain its fragrance in the mud. Her hair was tousled by the wind, her tattered skirt fluttered, but all of that could not hide the writhing figure of a mother trying to fight against the world. The child in her arms stirred slightly, its breath as fragile as a thread about to break, and she, with all her despair, held her child closer, as if it were the last fortress before the darkness swallowed her. Down below, long, sinuous shadows stretched out, stuck to the dusty ground, taking the form of nameless monsters. They slowly advanced, exuding the bloodthirsty scent of possession. The tavern door cast a dull yellow light, shimmering like a will-o'-the-wisp, illuminating the tragic scene. No one said a word. No one dared to step forward. All stood there, witnessing a deal of fate where two small people were pushed into the hands of darkness, and the iron hammer was about to strike down, to close it all. The sound of the hammer hitting the wood echoed throughout the square, like a cruel blow to fate. The flickering flames of the torches illuminated faces twisted by greed, eyes flashing, mouths screaming with blood, all like a pack of wolves circling their prey. The young woman, beautiful but consumed by grief, held the child tightly to her chest. Her hands trembled, her lips were purple, but her eyes held a desperate plea, as if hoping for some miracle to stop this nightmare. The crowd was in an uproar, the screams of the higher bidders drowning out the child's faint cries. Each coin thrown onto the table was like a knife cutting into her heart. Humiliation and grief mixed with the desert dust, turning the entire auction into a ghostly play where human souls were bought and sold like commodities. In the darkness at the edge of the square, another pair of eyes, cold and unpredictable, watched silently, unnoticed. The noise turned to chaos. The men pushed and shoved as if a mother's grief was just an excuse for a cruel bet. The coins glinted in the oil lamplight, then disappeared in the dirty palms. The auctioneer shouted, his throat hoarse but all the more excited. In that moment, the woman's face was clearly visible in the flickering light. Pale cheeks, tear-stained eyelashes, but still with a tragic, delicate beauty. A beauty that would make even the cruel hesitate. The child thrashed slightly, a broken cry that sounded like a hopeless plea. And then, from the darkness that had descended at the end of the square, a figure stepped out. A long, dark cloak, a wide-brimmed hat that half hid his face. He did not blend in with the noise, did not hastily raise his hand, but silently observed. The flame from the torch cast a long shadow of the man on the dusty ground, like a strange sign, a warning that the wind was about to change direction. The crowd did not notice, but something in the air suddenly fell silent for a moment, as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting. The moment the auctioneer raised his hand, ready to bring the hammer down again to seal the final price, a voice rang out, deep, steady, and strange, like distant thunder. The crowd fell silent. The eager faces changed color for a moment, for the voice did not belong to a greedy person, but to someone who did not seem to belong here. The man in the darkness stepped forward, his steps slow but steady, the firelight licking the hem of his cloak, revealing eyes as sharp as knives in the night. The woman looked up, her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the figure, like a drowning man suddenly seeing a ray of light on the horizon. The auctioneer paused, then curled his lips, thinking that this was just a fool trying to get in. But it was the strange silence of the crowd, who had been screaming like wild animals, that made him shiver. The whole square was filled with tension, the torch swaying in the wind, the wooden sound of the auction block creaking, the heavy breathing of the crowd. Something invisible was cracking, as if the nightmare was about to face its first challenger. The air was as tight as a bowstring about to snap. The stranger stopped in the middle of the square, his shadow stretched across the dust, blending into the flickering firelight like a crack in a nightmare. One of his hands gently rested on the butt of his gun, not too fast, not too slow, but enough to make the cowboys standing nearby sweat, because they knew that one wrong move would turn this place into a bloody hell. The auctioneer, his face slick with sweat, forced a mocking smile. He slammed his gavel on the table, the wood cracking loudly. "This is no place for a fake hero. If you don't buy, then get out of this game." The crowd snarled, and a few silently slid their hands down their belts, touching the butts of their guns. But there was an eerie silence around the stranger. He did not respond immediately, only raised his head, his eyes flashing under the brim of his hat. The woman looked at him tremblingly, her chest tightening with a fragile ray of hope, small but still bright in the midst of despair. The air was thick, each breath a flame illuminating the darkness, signaling that the moment of explosion was only a heartbeat away. The stranger raised his head, letting the firelight lick over half his face, sun-tanned, scarred, but as hard and immovable as a rock in a storm. His eyes were as sharp as cold steel, scanning the crowd. Each of them suddenly felt breathless, as if they had been seen through to the marrow of their bones. He spoke, deep, slow, and resonant like a drumbeat. "I will pay, but not in gold or silver." The crowd roared, some sneered, thinking he was crazy. The auctioneer laughed loudly, his yellow teeth flashing in the firelight. "If you don't have money, what are you going to pay with? With your life?" The stranger was silent for a moment, then his hand gently touched the butt of the gun. The silence was so heavy that the howling wind in the desert sounded like a scream. The mother hugged her child tightly to her chest, tears streaming down her face, not knowing if it was a sign of salvation or the beginning of a massacre. They were all standing on the thin line, where a single breath could ignite a fierce fire. The stranger's eyes flashed one last time. His hand tightened on the butt of his gun, but he did not draw it. The crowd froze, guns lurking in the darkness, like venomous snakes ready to strike at any moment. But there was something about his stance, calm, resolute, with the breath of death, that made even the bloodthirsty hesitate. The auctioneer, who had been smiling arrogantly, felt a chill run down his spine. His smile twisted. In that moment, no one could hear the wind, the fire, or the children crying. There was only a silence as heavy as stone, crushing every heart. The woman, trembling but her eyes shining, knew that fate might have brought her an unexpected ally. This blood auction was no longer a game for the greedy. It was about to turn into a life-and-death contest, where the strong would rewrite the outcome with guns and blood. The gunshots tore through the night. The flash of lightning caused the entire square to explode in chaos. The stranger turned to avoid the first bullet, his movements as fast as a wind cutting through the desert. The gun in his hand flashed. the loud explosion causing the people in the crowd to panic and quickly draw their weapons. The auctioneer screamed, diving down to hide behind the wooden platform, cursing and trembling. Smoke billowed up, mingling with the acrid smell of fire and sweat. The mother screamed, clutching her child tightly, bending low as if to melt into the ground. But there was still a strange light in her eyes. The hope of being freed, even if it meant paying with blood. The scene turned into hell, where every movement, every breath was bound by the roar of bullets and the pounding of hearts. The stranger was no longer a silent observer. He became a raging storm, each shot a cold verdict. One cowboy fell, his trembling hand clutching at his bloody chest, his mouth open in a final panic. Screams rang out from all around. Others rolled to avoid them. Others aimed their guns and fired wildly in terror. Dust and splinters flew as bullets tore through the auction block. The auctioneer, his face drained of blood, cowered behind him, eyes darting like a cornered rat. The mother, in the midst of the firestorm, shivered so much that she could hardly breathe, but still whispered a prayer, a whisper that only the child in her arms could hear. The firelight glinted on her tear-stained face, reflecting a mixture of fear and longing, hoping that the stranger's bullet would not only pierce the enemy's flesh, but also break the chains that held her fate. The square was no longer a place of commerce, but a bloody battlefield. Bullets whizzed by, ricocheting off wooden pillars, scattering splinters and sparks. The stranger moved through the rain of lead like a ghost, his body gliding through the dust, each bullet in his hand finding its target. A torch fell, the fire spread, the flickering light illuminating the frightened faces of those who had been cheering greedily a moment ago, now running frantically like frightened animals. The neighing of horses and the screams of men mingled into a cacophony of destruction. The mother, pressed against a wooden pillar, held her child so tightly that her hands turned white, feeling every bullet piercing the air. But in her panic, she realized the man was not simply a stranger. He was like an invisible hand of fate, sent to break the deadly silence that this town had tolerated for so long. And each shot he fired not only took back lives, but also engraved a bloody reminder into the history of this land. The flames from the fallen torch spread like a demon, licking through dry wood and straw. In the blink of an eye, the square was a sea of red fire. Those who had stood cheering now became prey to their own ambitions. Some fell into the smoke and fire, others shot wildly to escape. The stranger slowly advanced, his eyes cold as steel, his steps determined as if each burst of fire were nothing more than the dim lights of a deadly dance. A cowboy was shot, trying to crawl in the dust, his bloody hands desperately grasping the air. A mother huddled next to a burning pole, hugging her child tightly, the firelight illuminating her face, both sorrowful and resilient. The heartbreaking cries of the child drowned out the sound of the bullets, as if reminding that in this fierce hell, life still screamed for survival. The whole space was filled with the acrid smell of burning wood and blood, so heavy that it made it difficult to breathe. Gunshot after gunshot echoed through the thick smoke, making it difficult to distinguish friend from foe. The stranger crossed the line between life and death with terrifying coldness. He fired without hesitation, each bullet carrying the meaning of judgment on those who had turned people into commodities on the auction floor. A cowboy fell back into the flames, his body burning like a living torch. Screams echoed, tearing the air thick with the smell of blood and ash. The townspeople panicked and jostled each other to run away, but the mother's figure was still bent over in the flames, trembling and holding the baby as if holding on to her own life. Her tears mixed with the smoke and dust, but her hands still held on tightly, as if letting go would cause the whole world to collapse. In that flickering light, the image of her and the baby became a rare bright spot in the hellish night, reminding the stranger that the reason he pulled out his gun was not just for blood, but also for justice that had been dormant for too long. The fire had now engulfed the square, illuminating the night sky like an indelible curse. The figure of a stranger emerged from the smoke and fire like a living legend, his body covered in ash, his gun still raised, his eyes reflecting the fierce fire. Around him, those who had shouted bids were now lying scattered, their bodies convulsing or motionless, their blood mixed with the ash, creating black streaks. The neighing of horses, the cries of people for help, all echoed like a chorus of collapse. The mother knelt, holding her child tightly, her shoulders trembling, but her eyes strangely bright. Not just with fear, but also with the fragile belief that from these ashes, a new path could open. The townspeople, witnessing the horror, fled like insects burned by the light. each deeply haunted. There are nights when blood and fire are the true measure of justice, and amid the sea of red fire, the figure of the stranger stood upright, silent as if listening to the ancient whispers of this land. A promise that the price of sin will always be paid in blood. The fire finally died down, leaving only red ashes that smoldered like embers in the night. The once bustling square was now a cemetery, littered with corpses and charred wood. A few faint groans could be heard, as weak as the cries of wounded animals in the wilderness. The mother sat silently, her hair matted with smoke, her face smeared with dirt, but her eyes still held her child in her arms. The child hiccuped softly, his tiny hands moving weakly, as if life was clinging to the ashes. The stranger slowly lowered his gun, breathing steadily, but his eyes still alert. He stood there, a dark shadow against the mottled smoke, saying nothing, letting the night wind whistle through the half-burned beams. In that moment, the whole land held its breath, a silence so cold that one could smell the lingering scent of death. The darkness had swallowed the fire, but it had left behind a deeper, more terrifying darkness, the darkness in the hearts of the survivors. In the cold moonlight, the mother's face revealed streaks of dried tears on her coal dusty skin. The silver light made her look like a tragic monument, holding her little child in her arms, softly singing a lullaby intermittently amidst dry coughs. The stranger stood a few steps away, neither approaching nor leaving, his eyes fixed on the mother and child's figures, as if finding in them a lost memory. The night was long and dark, with only the crackling of ashes like the whispers of departed souls. For a moment, the stranger's eyes were moved, not by fire, not by blood, but by the image of a woman holding her child in the ruins, recalling something from the distant past. She turned to look at him, her wet eyes filled with both gratitude and doubt. Was this a savior, or just another ghost of this harsh West? In the silent void, those questions hung in the air, unanswered. As the wind blew through the crevices of the half-burned house, the stranger finally turned. His figure was tall and imposing, but gradually disappeared into the vast darkness on the horizon. The moonlight fell on the ash-covered ground, making his gait more like a wandering ghost than a flesh-and-blood man. The mother knelt down, holding the child tightly, her eyes following him until his figure completely disappeared. The child cried softly, the weak cry echoing among the smoldering ruins like a lone note in a Western ballad. In the sky, the shadows of crows and vultures began to hover, circling as if waiting for an unfinished feast. However, hidden beneath the death, there was still a vein of life, a mother and her child, small but resilient, like a seed that had not yet sprouted in the dry, rocky soil. The stranger left, carrying a mystery that no one understood, leaving behind a devastated town and a question bigger than any gunshot. Does justice really exist in this land? Or is it just a flash of fire in the dark night that then suddenly goes out? Darkness fell again, opening the next chapter of a bloody legend. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode.